was it. So I think we actually went one section into this page that begins the Confucian Renaissance. So why don't we just go and reread this from the start, from the Confucian Renaissance, page 12 of 41. And again, I think everyone here is a pretty good reader. Quan, I hope your microphone works better today. And we can just go.
Matt, I can try and stop me if it's too choppy.
Yes. So Quan, you want to start?
Okay. The rebirth of Confucianism in the Song Renaissance was a rebirth of Mencius, replacing the influence of Sun Tzu, whose ideas had dominated Confucian studies and official practice for over a millennium. Chu Si, AD 1130 to AD 1200, the greatest mind of the Song Renaissance, traced the historical course of the Confucian method. From Confucius and his immediate followers through Mencius, after which the method was lost until the 11th century with Changza and Zhou Tunyi, 1017 to 1073, the first of the so-called Neo-Confucians associated with Chu Si. Chu Si not only revived Mencius' ideas, but also his potential polemical method, issued devastating attacks on flaws in Taoist and Zen Buddhist ideology. Just as the rediscovery of the Platonic method in the West gave birth to the Golden Renaissance in the 15th century, so the Song Confucians, using the moral and scientific ideas of Confucius and Mencius, unleashed a conscious and economic explosion in 11th and 12th century China. I have compared the Confucian Renaissance, the Golden Renaissance in Europe, elsewhere, demonstrating the conceptual press between Chu Si and the Platonist Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa. Discoveries launched the Renaissance in Italy. It was Chu Si's ideas which inspired Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz in the 17th century to recognize in China a demonstration of St. Paul's dictum that the truth is inscribed in our hearts. Leibniz, who created the journal Novissima Sinica, News in Europe to publish historical and philosophical studies prepared by the Jesuit missionary scientists in China, believed that the highly developed Chinese culture and economy, exemplified by the extraordinarily large, by European standards, urban centers, and the advanced system of education, stood as proof that the Chinese had discovered, in some significant form, the same fundamental truths regarding man and nature as has guided the progress of Western civilization. In studying the translation of the Chinese classics prepared by the Jesuits, Leibniz recognized a natural theology which reflected the Platonic creation, perception of God and of man in the image through man's unique power of reason. In 1716, Leibniz wrote the natural theology of the Chinese, based specifically on the work of Chu Si. Chu Si's life was the culmination of 150 years of Song Renaissance scholarship, which became known as the School of Principle. The Taoist and Buddhist schools, which had dominated China for 1,000 years, had introduced various explanations of metaphysical concepts, questions which had gone unanswered by the Confucians since the suppression of Mencius in favor of Sun Tzu, Aristotelian pragmatism. Reviving the method of Mencius, Chu Si and his school of principle associated, resituated several of the Taoist and Zen concepts within metaphysics consistent with the ideas of Confucius and Mencius, again placing man and his creative potential to change the universe at the center of Chinese philosophy and statecraft. The most important of these transformed Taoist concepts was Li, not to be confused with the right, which is also pronounced Li, but has a totally distinct character and meaning. To the Taoists and Buddhists, the term Li represented a mystical unity of all things beyond rational understanding, as with the Taoist interpretation of the Tao, the way. As I have developed elsewhere, Chu Si used the term Li to signify a principle similar to Plato's idea of the good and to the Judeo-Christian creator God. The universal, eternal principle Li to Chu Si is indivisible, beyond time and place, and prior to all created things, but is also present in all created things, governor of things and events. Principle is also the determinant of the physical force inherent in all things, known as qi. All things reflect the lawful ordering of the universe through their own particular manifestation of principle, Li. Man, in particular, through a higher ordering of the material force, qi, and heaven's gift of Ran, agape, is capable of sharing consciously in universal principle through the creative power of the mind. To Chu Si, Li subsume the concept of a universe governed by lawfulness, a lawfulness intelligible to man in an everlasting imperfect manner. Chu Si also restored the notion of Ran to that understood by Confucius and Mencius. Ran had been used throughout history by scholars of every faith, but the term had become degraded over the centuries in love, in a more banal sense of sensual love, or at best, charity in the sense of good deeds. Confucius has explicitly written that spreading charity widely to save the multitudes is not Ran, a passage which is reminiscent of St. Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians, verse 13, and though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, agape, it profiteth me nothing. Chu Si insisted that Ran not to be perceived as simply love, but principle of love and the way of life. This was not a matter of semantics or philology, for Chu Si recognized that the quality of Ran, a love for truth itself, and for mankind as a whole, was the emotion of creativity, and therefore essential for society to survive and progress. The mind of heaven to produce things is Ran, he wrote. In man's endowment, he receives this mind from heaven, and thus he can produce. From Reflections on Things at Hand, 142. Thus, through Ran, man achieves the creative qualities of mind which elevate his capacity to know and to act according to universal principle. This ennobled view of man, known in Christianity as Imago Dei, man in the image of God, is the same epistemological impulse which underlay the creative work of the giants of the Renaissance, Nicolas of Cusa, Leonardo da Vinci, Johannes Kepler. In his writing China, Leibniz recognized these parallel conceptions as demonstration of the universality of human reason and as the basis for optimism regarding his grand design for the alliance of East and West. Leibniz viewed the relations between Europe and China as crucial for the development of the world as a whole, as he's expressed in the introduction to his 1697 Novissima Sinica, News from China, I consider it a singular plan of the fates that human cultivation and refinement should today be concentrated at its were to extra continent in Europe and in China, which adorns the Orient as Europe does the opposite edge of the earth. Perhaps Supreme Providence has ordained such an arrangement so that as the most cultivated and distant peoples stretch out their arms to each other, those in between may gradually be brought to a better way of life. I will not repeat here the full development of the school of principle of Chu Si for present purposes. To examine the potentials within the current revival of cultural optimism in China and to counter the fraud of the deconstructionists dominating Western Chinese scholarship, it is necessary to note the manner in which Chu Si re-established a Mencian concept of the right, recovering that concept from the straitjacket of formalism and rules of conduct. In the process, Chu Si also developed a civic method grounded in the renewed, elevated view of the rights.
Cool. Thank you.
Do I start, Matthew?
Yeah,
Thanks.
You're a wonderful reader, but every 11th word or so, it would chop out. So unfortunately for people listening, it might be prohibitive. But yeah, I mean, it was very
okay,
simple.
cool.
And yeah, that means if you are reading or listening to this recording, you could pull up the text and read along. That would help a lot, which is in the description of this video. So would anybody else like to read? Nick or Jerry or Bob? You might be on mute, by the way. Nick, you want to go for it?
Yeah, I was going to say Bob could go first, but I can go. Sorry, I'm just finding it on.
Yeah, we're on page 30. It says 38, but it's actually page 13.
Oh, the rights and natural law. Having firmly established the concept of principle, Li, as the fundamental lawfulness of the universe, and demonstrating the principle of heaven, Tian Li, to be the strongest and most positive thing, Xu Ji then presented the rights as the measures and patterns of the principle of heaven and the regulation of human affairs. It is important to note that this comes from Xu Ji's commentaries on the Book of Confucius, the Analects, and the Book of Mencius, which Xu Ji considered to be his best and most important works, for which not a single word may be added and not a single word deleted. Xu Ji insisted that the ethics governing mankind must derive from the principle of heaven, as measured by man. They cannot be arbitrary constructs, nor mere custom, nor pragmatic social contracts imposed on society. The modern nation state has developed the concept of a constitution as a statement of universal principle, not delineating each and every right or prohibition, but providing the moral framework within which such positive law must be bounded. So also the rights provided the measure of the principle of heaven. They are not perfect. The only perfection is in the principle of heaven, or Plato's the good, which cannot be precisely or completely reduced to language. But the rights are not arbitrary. They represent the distillation of mankind's most profound thoughts on the nature of man and the physical universe, composed as a relatively eternal statement of universal principle. Such principles are tested over time by the long-term success or failure of a society, measured by its capacity to generate expanding populations at higher per capita standards of culture and material existence, what LaRouche calls the relative potential population density. Xu Ji emphasized above all else in his studies of the classics of Confucius and Mencius that the core of scientific method and the necessity of that method was implicit in the works of these two great sages of antiquity. Xu Zhi selected 4 texts, which became known as the 4 books, to serve as the core reading for education in China for the next 750 years. The 4 books were the Analects of Confucius, the Book of Mencius, and 2 extended selections from the Book of Rites, called the Doctrine of the Mean and the Great Learning, or Learning for Adults, as Xu Zhi preferred to call it. Xu Zhi drew upon the most famous passage from the Book of Rites, the preface to the Great Learning, believed to have been written by Confucius himself, to develop his notions of scientific method. The passage is usefully compared to the preamble to the US Constitution. The Great Learning from the Book of Rites. The ancients, wishing that all men under heaven keep their inborn luminous virtue unobscured, first had to govern the nation well. Wishing to govern the nation well, they first established harmony in their household. Wishing to establish harmony in their households, they first cultivated themselves. Wishing to cultivate themselves, they first set their minds in the right. Wishing to set their minds in the right, they first developed sincerity of thought. Wishing to have sincerity of thought, they first extended their knowledge to the utmost. The extension of knowledge lies in fully apprehending the principle of things. Preamble to the US Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. The classical Chinese text, like all classical writing, was poetic in nature and thus metaphoric rather than rigidly precise. Xu Zhi interpreted the above passage in 2 ways, which differed from traditional interpretations, and in so doing enhanced the power of the underlying concepts, laying the basis for the Confucian Renaissance. First, the words in the opening passage. The ancients, wishing that all men under heaven keep their inborn luminous virtue unobscured, had been previously read as the ancients, in order to manifest luminous virtue to all under heaven, i.e., implying that the ruler must manifest virtue in order to achieve good government. Xu Zhi insisted that the passage conveyed a far broader meaning, that all men were born with luminous virtue, and that the purpose of government was the uplifting of the natural virtuous qualities of all mankind, just as the US Constitution holds that a more perfect union depends upon the promotion of the general welfare. Xu Zhi rejected the feudalist notion of government, in which the population was viewed as the property of feudal lords, much like cattle. He put forth instead an ennobled view of the common man, in which each man is endowed with the potential to participate in the development of the state through his creative powers, his inborn luminous virtue, a view of government which was successfully implemented only with the development of the concept of the nation state during the Golden Renaissance in Europe, which led to the demographic explosion worldwide following the 15th century.
Okay, that is really beautiful. I never quite, even though I'd read this, it didn't quite dawn on me the importance of the parallel between the US Constitution and what Confucius writes in the Analects. This is really something. There's a footnote, though, that we missed that I just noticed now, footnote 19, which unpacks a little bit more of this. Does somebody, Bob, you want to read footnote 19?
Sure. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States were both explicit attacks on the Aristotelian school of British empiricists led by John Locke in favor of the Platonic school led by G.W. Leibniz.
Where the Declaration identifies the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, Locke had demanded the right to property as fundamental, including the ownership of slaves. Where the Constitution is aimed at promotion of the general welfare for ourselves and our posterity, Locke promoted the right to inheritance, to protect only the aristocratic families against the common interest. Locke's views, which derived from the slave society of Lycurgus of Sparta, were incorporated into the Constitution of the Confederate States of America in the British instigated Civil War of 1860 to 65, which was aimed at dismembering the US just as the British intelligence operations today are aimed at dismembering China.
Thanks.
So, to continue.
Yep.
Zhu Zi's second new interpretation came in the concluding passage. He argued that the notion of extending knowledge demanded more than the empirical investigation of things, if that were interpreted as merely recording sense impressions. Rather, Zhu Zi insisted that true knowledge lies only in fully apprehending the principle in things. Besides the many physical attributes of things and events, one must investigate the invisible qualities, those characteristics which connect the object or event in a causal way to the changing universe, what Leibniz called analysis situs. Zhu Zi wrote that this method, with diligence, would reveal the manifest and the hidden, the subtle and the obvious qualities of all things. The Book of Rights thus placed a rigorous scientific method as the foundation for each link of a causal chain, as the necessary source of knowledge, of sincerity of thought, of self-cultivation, of domestic harmony, and of good government. Zhu Zi chose to separate out the two sections of the Book of Rights with good reason. Other sections of the Book of Rights were written by Jun Si. Rather than universal principles, the sections by Jun Si are endless prescriptions of step-by-step ritual practices to be carried out at especially occasions of birth and death. While such rituals have their importance, they are certainly not the essence of the rites. It was the universal conception, as developed by Zhu Zi, which was the epistemological basis for both the artistic and the scientific developments of the Confucian Renaissance, and the explosive economic and demographic growth during the Song Dynasty. The Song Renaissance was crushed by the Mongol invasions in the 13th century, but the school of principle of Zhu Zi was the dominant force behind each subsequent era of development during the Ming Dynasty, 1368 AD to 1644, and the Qing Dynasty, 1644 AD to 1911. Conversely, in the periods during which this school was overshadowed by a return to the three religions, Chinese culture and society declined and often collapsed. See Figure 1.
Figure 1 is, for those only listening, an image of Friedrich Nietzsche and The Death of Socrates, a painting by Jacques-Louis David from 1787. And Billington has the subcaption to that saying, The Death of Socrates portrays the philosopher's judicial murder. Above, Nazi forethinker Friedrich Nietzsche, father of Deconstructionism. Quan, I was wondering, could you say a word or two about the three religions to which Billington is referring to in the last paragraph?
Yeah, well, the concept of the three religions is a kind of syncretic creation or syncretic mix of Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and not the best Confucianism, the Confucianism coming from Sun Tzu rather than from Kongzi, which is the Chinese name of Confucius. While the mainstream Confucianism from Kongzi thinks that man is born good, the famous inborn luminous virtue taught by Chu Si. And in the case of Sun Tzu, he, as all oligarchical view, he would view mankind as kind of beasts or cattle to be controlled. So the three religions is a mix of everything not very brilliant and not very principled, coming from Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. It's a kind of superstition, if you want, for the people.
Thank you.
I have a question about the Taoism. I haven't read much, but is that idea that good and evil have equal substance, similar to, similar to what Augustine was fighting against in the West?
Yeah. Exactly. I would say that if you remember the image of the Tao, the circle with a black fish and a white fish, the good interpretation is that the circle is supreme, meaning that perfection is slightly superior to evil. But the bad interpretation is to give equality between good and bad. So the right interpretation is that the circle being perfect, the inborn luminous nature of virtue is slightly superior to the evil forces.
That's interesting, Quan. I really like that nuance you're bringing up because, yeah, like if you just take the content of the circle of the black and the white aspects, it seems like they're counterbalancing, whereas the circle has no opposite. There's no anti-circle that can have claim to real existence. So I like the way you're approaching it. That's very constructive.
It's not my interpretation. It's the classical interpretation.
Beautiful. Well said. Okay. Deconstructing China. So this is the new section. So who would like to read Deconstructing China? Bob?
I'll read. British colonial control has always rested upon the Roman imperial policy of divide and conquer. This entailed the careful profiling of subject populations, drawing out ethnic and religious differences, while supporting or even creating anew ideologies which enhance divisiveness, subservience to colonial rule, and the rejection of national republican movements. The recent postmodernist or deconstructionist efforts to provide such profiles of Chinese ideology are not, strictly speaking, new or original. They draw on a rich tradition going back to Lord Palmerston's 19th century sponsorship of radical movements across the globe to destabilize political enemies or countries targeted for colonization. Palmerston directly supported the bloody Taiping Rebellion in China in the 1850s and 60s, while simultaneously launching a direct British military assault on the beleaguered government forces, the so-called Second Opium War. China was reduced to semi-colonial status for the remainder of the Ming Dynasty era. Following the Republican Revolution of 1911, Lord Bertrand Russell led British intelligence efforts against Sun Yat-sen's Republican influence, including the sponsorship of iconoclastic Jacobin factions within and around the newborn Communist Party. In the Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong errors, eminent British scholars such as Dr. Joseph Needham continued Russell's profiling and psychological warfare efforts in service to the British world government policies. The common element of all these operations, including that of the deconstructionists today, is their attempt to undermine or destroy Confucian tradition while enhancing the Taoist, irrationalist, empiricist currents within Chinese history and culture. I will examine in detail the most recent contribution to this cultural warfare, Anticipating China, by the above cited David L. Hall and Roger T. Ames, before placing it in the context of 150 years of British subversion in China. To deconstruct Confucius, Ames knew that he must first deconstruct Plato. By destroying the common underlying concept of rationality in each, both could then be reconstructed as anti-rational, although in different ways. Ames presents the Platonic and Socratic method of hypothesis as nothing significantly different from the logic of Aristotle, and then lies that all Western civilization and Western science derive from Aristotle's mechanistic view of man and nature. He then proceeds to present Confucius from the perspective of Zunzi as a pragmatist and Taoist, and defines Chinese thought as fundamentally anti-rational or as correlativist. At the same time, Ames denounces and dismisses Mencius and simply ignores Zhu Zi and the Song Confucian Renaissance. Thus, Western thought is deconstructed, eliminating Platonic reason, and reconstructed as pure Aristotelian logic, the Enlightenment view of man as beast in a mechanistic universe. Eastern thought, on the other hand, while also deconstructed and relieved of Confucian Ren, agape, and reason, is reconstructed as anti-logical, which Ames calls correlativist or analogical. These false constructs, which render both East and West intellectual eunuchs, are then contrasted with each other to demonstrate the incompatibility and incommensurability of the East and the West. The clash of civilizations of Harvard professor Samuel Huntington is thus established.
Wow. Okay, that was a short section, Bob. So you can read go ahead and read another section. And there's a footnote 21, which is a beefy one, it seems. Does somebody want to read footnote 22? Or is it 21 or 22? What am I looking at?
22.
22.
22.
Sure, I'll read it.
Yeah.
The ubiquitous Harvard professor Samuel Huntington promoted the end of democracy in the 1970s, arguing that there was not enough wealth to go around to meet the democratic demands of the minorities which had won some of their civil rights in the 1960s, nor for the nations which had won their independence from colonialism. See Michele Cloutier, Samuel.
Yeah, you don't have to cite the individual works.
He then promoted authoritarian democracy in the 1980s to enforce deregulation, free trade, and austerity as demanded by globalization, the new colonialism. His 1990s contribution, The Clash of Civilizations, calling for global race war of the West versus the Confucian and Islamic world, is just a continuation of this service to the British Crown.
Dirty. All right. Bob, you want to keep it going?
Sure. Nietzsche's demonization of Socrates and Plato. Ames presents a yin-yang view of his two constructs of correlativism versus rationality, meaning, in fact, logic. Both forms of thought existed in antiquity, he says, in both Europe and Asia, but through Socrates, rationality became dominant in the West, while through Zunzi, correlativism came to dominate the East. He glories in he glories in the fact that his hero, Friedrich Nietzsche, has finally reintroduced anti-rational thinking in the West. Nietzsche's psychotic raving against his enemy Socrates is the direct source of Ames's distorted representation of Socratic and Platonic ideas. Nietzsche portrayed Socrates as the source of all that was wrong in the world. Because of Socrates' belief, false in Nietzsche's view, that man, through reason, was capable of discovering the lawfulness of the universe and thereby of participating in the unfolding of creation. In his 1872, The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music, Nietzsche refers to the profound illusion, this is a quote, that first saw the light of the world in the person of Socrates, the unshakable faith that thought, using the thread of logic, can penetrate the deepest abysses of being, and that thought is capable not only of knowing being, but even of correcting it. This sublime metaphysical illusion accompanies science as an instinct, unquote. The concept under attack by Nietzsche is precisely the Platonic root of the idea identified in Christianity as imago Dei or capax Dei. Associated with this concept of a man in the image of God is the optimism and faith which flows from the knowledge that man is born fundamentally good, in that he or she is provided by heaven with the creative powers and the emotional strength to solve the problems of continuing human development. It is here that Nietzsche becomes most apoplectic. Quote, consider the consequence of Socratic maxims. Virtue is knowledge. Man sins only from ignorance. He who is virtuous is happy. In these basic forms of optimism lies the death of tragedy. Socratic culture, optimism, with its delusion of a limitless power. We must not be alarmed if the fruits of this optimism ripen, if society leavened to the very lowest strata by this kind of culture gradually begins to tremble with want or agitations and desires for earthly happiness, unquote. Ames, while harboring the same enraged hatred for Socrates as does his mentor Nietzsche, attempts to present a less rabid attack as required by his parallel soft attack on Confucius and Mencius. What results, however, is either an unabashed bit of sophistry and lies, or an astonishing display of ignorance and lack of comprehension of Plato's ideas. Ames praises Heraclitus, who viewed the universe as a constant process of change and becoming. Ames declares this view to be the opposite of rationality, since he has falsely defined rationality to be nothing but linear logical thinking about a fixed universe. He adds, quote, China is characteristically Heraclitean. Correlative thinking in China is not dominated by the demands of rational or empirical objectivity. Boy, this is chaos theory. Heraclitus was, in fact, and contrary to Ames' contention, the source for Plato's development of his concept of becoming. Plato solves the paradox of the one and the many by showing that the individual reflects the process of the development of the whole. And through creative reason, the individual acts to change the whole. But Ames puts forth what would be called, in the modern vernacular, a whopper. Plato never accepted Heraclitus, he claims, but rather followed the ideas of Parmenides, the ontological dualism of the intellectual dualism of Parmenides, which received its paradigmatic synthesis in Platonic thinking. Since it is inconceivable that Ames and his associate David Hall have not read Plato's Parmenides dialogue, it must be concluded that they either totally misunderstand it or chose to use the Goebbels big lie approach, perhaps in keeping with their gushing admiration for the Nazi philosopher Martin Heidegger. Parmenides rejected change as an illusion, insisting that all being is one, fixed, unchangeable, including human thought. His student Zeno, like his latter-day epigony Bertrand Russell, spun a series of paradoxes proving that motion is impossible based on the assumption that there is no change and that time and space are pre-existent fixed entities in nature. Plato, in the Parmenides dialogue, subjects this foolishness to ridicule by allowing Parmenides himself to carry through an exercise in Aristotelian logical reasoning based on his assumption of no change, resulting in a mass of contradictions that prevents coherent thought about anything whatsoever. And yet, Ames claims that the Parmenidean philosophy was never successfully refuted. Mm-hmm. Zeno, he states, drove a wedge between the claim of reason and those of sense perception that even the most subtle of his opponents has not been able to remove. Not surprisingly, Ames then ignores the entire history of philosophy and science as if neither motion nor thinking ever took place, but skips forward to the 20th century for admiring comments about Zeno from Bertrand Russell himself.
Wait, just quick. There was a footnote 23 that might be worth looking at here. Nick, could you read footnote 23? Or Jerry? Or Quan? Or Sam?
Okay, I want to read it.
Yeah.
Okay, I will read it. It's not too long, so it's not be too choppy. The notion of a fixed absolute time and space, independent of the substances and activities which actually define time and space, was the fraud in the Newtonian hypothesis, despite his declaration that he had no need of hypothesis, as demonstrated conclusively by Leibniz in his letters to Newton's associate, Samuel Clarke.
Okay, let's see.
Where do we?
We were at Ames then deconstructs the Socratic method. In place of the process of the higher hypothesis, deriving an ever less imperfect understanding of the laws of the universe in pursuit of truth, Ames baldly states that Socrates strove only for definitions and to set finite boundaries. In fact, Socrates forced his students to find truth not in fixed concepts, but in the in-betweenness of successive higher understandings of concepts in the process of discovery. Ames, however, writes that Socrates offered the method of open-ended inquiry as a means of withholding judgments of truth or falsity until certainty is attained, as if truth lay in only some conclusory definition or in the conclusion of an Aristotelian syllogism. He incredibly claims that Socrates shunned the subjective, seeking closure in objective definitions.
There's actually just quick, I just wanted to share one experience I had when I was working at a college in Montreal, and there was a teacher who was in charge of pedagogy, a pedagogical counselor, and she was telling me that her view of the Platonic method was that it was authoritarian because it involved asking contentious questions to students to get them to lead them to an answer that you've predetermined, which she said rightfully probably deprives the student of their ability to have free thought, because it's a very, very like crystallized definition that you want to trick them into coming towards on their own terms, which is not really the spirit of what Plato's method actually is, but it's really just this because Plato never gives you a strict definition by the end of any of his dialogues, right? He always leaves you with a bunch of paradoxes and perplexities, so your mind is in motion, but he's doing it in a way that allows you to have like fertile mental soil to come to a discovery. Whereas what they have, it's like a false shell of Platonic methods by just like, forcing. It's basically what this Ames guy is describing Plato to be, which is not really the real thing. There's no discovery there. It's just to come to a right answer acceptable to the elite.
Right. I mean, it very much is the idea of saying that Aristotle, his categories, what you do is you take Plato and Socrates and you categorize ideas, in such a way as to make them dead. And that's exact. It's funny what they do. I'm right now investigating how Cusa is labeled a mystic, and it's the same type of Delphic operation to dismiss everything about Cusa as a mystic, and in fact, it's totally wrong. You can show that Cusa's ideas actually led to massive scientific breakthroughs. It wasn't an accident that the co-thinkers led to the discovery of the New World, the map makers and so forth, at the same time that he was working. And the people that made massive breakthroughs, like the dome, were making scientific breakthroughs based on Cusa's method of discovery. It had nothing to do with mysticism, but this is the way that these guys work. They want to stop you from actually recreating the method of thinking of Socrates or Plato, and just dismiss it by these categories that are dead. They want to deaden thought. And anyhow, I'll go on from there. The stage is thus set for the claim that Aristotelianism and Platonic thought are essentially the same. To overcome the glaring fact that Aristotle denies the existence of any universal truths, Ames declares Aristotle's logic to be a universal, since Aristotle considered it to be a tool employed by all who would come to know. With this bit of sophistry in hand, Ames declares, quote, "For all their vaunted differences, Plato and Aristotle share a significant number of dispositions that render their disputes family quarrels among proponents of a common culture. Each believes in a single ordered world. Both have faith in the efficacy of reason in searching out the laws which define the structure of that world and the relation of the human mind to that structure." And unquote. And finally, the ultimate purpose of this deconstructionism, Ames declares the Chinese incapable of Platonic reason, as they are virtually a different species whose thought processes are inconsistent with reason. Quote, "The broad traditions of Plato and Aristotle are unlikely to have any true counterparts in classical China. This means that not only should we avoid the temptation to look for Chinese versions of Plato and Aristotle, but neither should we draw from either of these visions in interpreting Chinese thinkers. The Platonic and Aristotelian modes of organizing knowledge are inconsistent with Chinese modes of organization."
Whoa.
Unquote. Plato's ideas, he continues, have no real equivalent among Chinese thinkers, while the notion of causality, and particularly the notion of efficient cause, is not a category which may be relevantly employed in interpreting Chinese thinkers. The Chinese, to Ames, were not forced to become obsessed with the goal of providing a rational account of motion and change. While there is truth to the claim that the Chinese have not generally emphasized linear systems of logic, to contend that the Chinese were not concerned with the rationality of change is a disgusting, if all too typical piece of sophistry. In fact, Ames gladly embraces the sophist of ancient Athens, the moral relativist who held popular opinion under the influence of society's most persuasive leaders to be the ultimate determinant of truth. Here, the postmodern deconstructionists show their true colors as the spokesman and apologists for the demagogues and tyrants. The sophists were true pragmatists, writes Ames approvingly, who sought solidarity with the masses through persuasion and appealed to their most immediate limited concerns. This is precisely the ideology of empire, including the manipulation of ethnic, religious, and racial differences in order to keep subject populations divided amongst themselves. It was Socrates, cries Ames, in a Nietzschean fit of rage, who tried to counter sophist relativism by inquiring after objective truths concerning the nature of virtue, thus leading to the triumph of damned rationalism over relativism.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah.
Good.
Can I just add one thing there?
Yeah, do it.
It's just hilarious. This quote from Ames that Mike talks about, that we should avoid the temptation to look for Chinese versions of Plato and Aristotle. I'm just thinking, when I was watching the video of last week's reading, just even from the first couple pages, it hit me like a 2x4, just the total similarity between Confucius, Mencius, and Xu and Plato and Socrates. It was just so obvious to me. It was so exciting. But here, Ames says we have to avoid looking for that. I just find that hilarious.
Yeah, and they're attacking Leibniz without even mentioning his name as well. You know.
Right, that the principle of sufficient reason has no corollary in China.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
So dirty.
Right.
Jerry, do you want to keep reading?
Yeah, okay, I'll try. I'm just having a little problem with my vision, but.
Oh, well, all right. Feel free to stop at any point.
Okay, if I switch over and I read it on the from the Schiller Institute one, it's clearer than.
Well, why don't you go and do that? Pull up the Schiller Institute version on your. Is that hard for you to do?
No, that's what I'm doing now.
Okay.
I just switched over.
All right.
Okay, let me start. Han thinking is Chinese thinking. That's in quotations. Since Chunzi's form of legalist Taoist Confucianism dominated the Han Dynasty, writes Ames, scholarly dispute was tempered by a fundamental commitment to mutual accommodation. There is a general distaste for contentiousness and an active cultivation of the art of accommodation. What Ames praises here is the absence of the fierce polemics found in Mencius against the errors and immorality of the Taoists and the nascent legalists of his day. The rigorous search for truth was generally replaced during the Han period by the pragmatism and dogmatism of empire, tempered with the liberal toleration of mystical beliefs as a means for pacifying the ignorant masses. This is the true China, claims Ames. Han thinking is the specifically Chinese mode of thinking. Ames had to admit that Chunzi, a true Aristotelian, was something of a rationalist, but he was nonetheless a correlativist, since his rationalism is grounded in history and culture without appeal to metaphysical determinants. History was viewed by Chunzi as cyclical, change without progress, without logical or causal relationships from one period to the next. There's a footnote there, 24. I can read it if you want. Interestingly, Ames compares this to art in the West, where he claims there is no progress from one artist to the next, only change. Thus do the postmodernists endorse the cult of the ugly, which dominates 20th century culture. Okay, continuing. This cyclical, primitive way of thinking is ascribed to the Chinese as culturally, or even genetically, their natural mode of cognition. Ames quotes approvingly from Frenchman Jacques Journet and Englishman A.C. Graham, China scholars who both peddle the postmodernist worldview. Journet boldly asserts that the Chinese are a different kind of humanity, who have different mental categories and modes of thought. Graham, applauded by Ames for popularizing the view of Chinese correlative thinking, described deconstructionist guru Jacques Derrida as the first Western yin-yang Taoist. Okay, and another footnote, 25. Someone want to read that one?
Yeah, I'll read it.
Okay.
Not all China scholars in the West endorsed the racist, degrading, and incompetent ravings of the deconstructionists. The dean of U.S. China Studies, Columbia University's William Theodore DeBerry, for example, has dedicated much of his life to exploring and analyzing the work of Zhu Xi and like thinkers in Chinese history. However, the fact that postmodernists like Ames are in prominent positions in the institutions of the journals of China scholarship, as they are in all other academic departments as well, indicates the seriousness of the problem.
Okay.
Just quickly, Quan, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure, please.
Could you describe what this correlative thinking is in your own words? Because I don't think that was properly defined yet by Mike Billington.
Yeah, well, let's say correlation is when you see the simultaneous apparition between a group A and group B, okay? So correlation is when there is no causality. See it as the incapability to create or to understand or to discover causality. Okay, so when you have group B, you see the simultaneous apparition of group A, but you're not capable to make the connection of causal relationship between group A and group B, or even A and even B.
So simply observing that there is likeness of one group to another group?
Or simultaneous apparition, or chronological apparition, and not causality linkages.
Okay, that's good. That's good. Thank you.
No problem.
All right, Jerry.
Okay, continuing. In fact, the deconstructionist methods against the Chinese are exactly the same as their methods against cultural optimism everywhere. The creation of indigenous movements among primitive peoples, generally coordinated by London's Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization, UNPO, is aimed at preventing development in both advanced and underdeveloped nations, under the guise of protecting the miserable, impoverished lifestyle of the targeted indigenous peoples. In most cases, the children of such tribal people have had no interest in remaining in the bush when offered the opportunity of assimilating themselves into civilized urban culture. This causes severe problems for the oligarchs' anthropologists, who try to glorify the happy savage mythology. The UNPO plays upon the often very real poverty of tribal people, but claims that they would be better off if left alone with their original primitive culture, and demands the right to prevent their development, or the development of, in many cases, thousands of square miles of territory. The psychological method involved is expressed quite clearly by Ames. Quote, "The most profound expression of Western ethnocentrism, therefore, is to be found in the rejection of provincial beliefs tied to a particular ethos, in favor of the belief that science and rationality will eventually provide the standards for all mankind." Unquote. It is this same approach, glorifying the anti-rational as a natural character trait, which has been used in the West to create and manipulate the particularist movements of the post-1960s, to turn various layers of society against each other and against science and technology. It is the method of the Frankfurt School, which set itself the task after World War II of destroying the Judeo-Christian culture of the Western nations. It was the pervasive belief in the goodness of man and the efficacy of reason to advance civilization, argued the Frankfurt School, which prevented Marxism from taking hold in the West. Alternative belief structures, locating identity not in the power of reason, but in blood, soil, ethnicity, or gender, were generated by the dozens by the Frankfurt crew and their associates at London's Tavistock Institute. The Harvard professors...
Wait, hold on, 1 sec. Did we look at footnote 28?
I don't think we're there yet.
No, we're not there yet? Okay, sorry.
No, there was footnote 26, but
Yeah.
that just referred to the Mike Mendicino article.
Okay, good.
Fidelio.
All right.
Okay, continuing. The Harvard professors teaching deconstructionism today continue that tradition, designing such things as Black English, recently dubbed Ebonics, whose purpose is to block access to classical education for Black Americans. Harvard psychologist Howard Gardner defines 7 distinct types of intelligence, such as bodily, kinesthetic, musical, or logical mathematical. Okay. Some types of people, argues Gardner, are naturally better in some of these types, deficient in others. Broad layers of Black America have been indoctrinated in a primitive belief structure which leaves out all reference to reason in favor of communal feelings. Although designed to appear African with tribal roots, the structure was actually designed in the halls of Anglo-American academia.
Wow.
And there's footnote 28 for you, Matt. That's a...
Yeah, 28's the beefy one. That's the scandalous one.
Oh, yes.
Sure, I'll read it.
Okay, good.
Okay, CEIR Special Report, Never Again, London's Genocide Against Africans, June 1997, for a preliminary investigation of the current genocide in Central Africa being carried out by British intelligence through colonial puppets Yoweri Museveni of Uganda and Laurent Kabila in Zaire on behalf of the British Commonwealth's raw materials cartels. Both of these pliant revolutionaries were trained at Tanzania's Dar es Salaam University in the 1960s, set up by Julius Nyerere, Britain's foremost asset in sub-Saharan Africa. The curriculum at Dar es Salaam was designed and taught by Tavistock Institute and Frankfurt School operatives based on the methods of Bertrand Russell, Martin Heidegger, and Frantz Fanon, glorifying violence as a necessary means for personal liberation and revolutionary praxis as being superior to reason. It is of crucial significance that such British-controlled revolutionaries were nurtured in Maoist rhetoric. Many visited China at the peak of the Cultural Revolution madness. Across the globe, terrorist assets of the British intelligence formed for the purpose of preventing the emergence of strong, independent nation-states in the developing world were brought to Europe, often to France, to the radical existentialist milieu of Heidegger's protégés, Jean-Paul Sartre and Frantz Fanon, and then laundered through cultural revolutionary China to provide a Maoist cover for British operations. This is true for such demonic figures as Abimael Guzman of Peru's Shining Path and Pol Pot of Cambodia's Khmer Khmer Rouge, as well as Yoweri Museveni and Laurent Kabila, who trained in Maoist Albania, who are now carrying out the greatest rate of genocide of modern history against the Hutu of the Great Lakes region of Africa. Also created at Dar es Salaam University was the Ujamaa belief structure, a concoction of tribal codes which studiously rejects science and cognitive reason in favor of emotional and associative feeling states. This synthetic African form of Maoism, actually created in the psychological warfare laboratories in London for application in Africa, was then transplanted into the US by totally owned assets of the Tavistock Institute and the Frankfurt School, such as Imamu Baraka and Ron Karenga. This glorification of pagan irrationality has been used to construct a synthetic black holiday, Kwanzaa, based on Ujamaa. Popularized through extensive racist media support, Kwanzaa has become an anti-Christian pagan alternative to Christmas for blacks only, of course.
Whoa.
He's taking away our Kwanzaa.
Yeah. Just for blacks. It's not racist at all, is it?
Now, I think you covered some of this in the class you gave before, Nick.
Yeah, very, very lightly. I mean, it's so deep, this stuff. But we did speak about the Dar es Salaam University, yeah. I actually got a lot of that material from a Fidelio article. I can't remember now who. I think it was Dennis Speed, actually. Or was it Dennis? Oh, I always get mixed up between those two, but yeah.
Yeah, it was Dennis Speed, yeah.
Yeah.
The black faces of neocolonialism, or British colonialism.
Yeah.
But it's good to compare this this Dar es Salaam school with Chikanta Diop and the ideas you talked about there too.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that would be a really good class, actually.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great idea. Yeah, a class or an art. Nick, are you thinking about that?
Go on then. Yeah, why not? Now I am.
Good. We'll talk after this this reading session. I have an idea.
All right then, great.
Okay.
Okay, continuing.
Yep.
Similarly, various feminist ideologies argue that women do not think cognitively, but associatively, free of the tyranny of reason, and so on for other subdivision of the human race. Ames acknowledges that his own efforts are part of this general assault on reason. He praises the, quote, movements such as process philosophy, postmodernism, and the new pragmatism, which are unearthing the analogical correlative roots of language. The transition from modern to postmodern perspectives is not merely a theoretical shift. It entails a vast network which is drawn together in a single mix, movements as seemingly diverse as Deconstructionism, the new historicism, cultural studies, and feminist criticism, all of which at one level or another are rooted in the critique of the rationality of language. My wife's printing something here. The emergence of ethnic and gender-related movements has challenged the objectivity of rational methods by claiming them to be ideologically grounded, unquote. I ran out of paper, my dear.
Oh, good.
Okay, sorry about that. It is precisely such an irrationalist, pragmatic mentality which the British and their ideological warriors hope to induce within China today to undermine the rebirth of the passion for truth, enthusiasm, which guided Confucius, Mencius, and Shu Si while also distinguishing from the West the actual roots of the current burst of Chinese cultural optimism.
One thing I just want to bring up here, if you look at the manifesto of the Black Lives Matter right now, it's absolutely based on this stuff. You know, I mean, this is what these guys say. We have to break up the traditional family, you know, and the whole thing it's right there. It's no different.
Yeah, no, not at all. Same method.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there an actual singular manifesto of BLM?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, and it has right in it this idea of feminism and that irrationality, and there's no genders any longer. It's a real, I mean, they're really attacking on the same rationality. It's very clear if you actually look at what their principles are. They have them all elucidated, and it's a manifesto, and it's based on this stuff to a T.
Huh. Okay. I gotta read that.
Yeah.
All right, we've now arrived at a new section titled The Shaping of Modern China, with 3 images for those listening, featuring one, the Jesuit father or brother Adam Schall von Bell, another one, the Beijing Observatory, designed and furnished by Ferdinand Verbiest, and another more ominous picture of the Opium Wars, where the British and French troops stormed Beijing in 1860. So who would like to read The Shaping of Modern China, Section 1?
Go for it.
Yeah.
Although the Golden Era, Song Dynasty's Confucian Renaissance was crushed by the 14th
Wait,
century.
Nick, you gotta, could you talk direct? Because sometimes when you talk, we hear you great, and other times we don't hear you very well. So I think it's the direction your voice is facing towards your device.
Okay.
Like right now, amazing.
Great. Is that good, yeah?
Yeah.
Cool. The Shaping of Modern China. Although the golden era of the Song Dynasty's Confucian Renaissance was crushed by the 14th century onslaught of the Mongol hordes, the scientific and humanistic impulse of Xu and the school of principle was revived in the early Ming Dynasty between 1368 and 1644, and again in the early Qing Dynasty between 1644 and 1911. I have discussed these developments elsewhere, but will briefly review 2 issues which are necessary to understand the deconstructionist assault on China today, the movement created by Wang Yangming, 1472 to 1529, which played a subversive role within Confucianism, similar to the role of Sun Tzu in antiquity, and the issue of the rights controversy in the 17th and 18th centuries, which was used by the Venetian oligarchy to disrupt and destroy the century of ecumenical collaboration between Renaissance leaders in the Christian West and the Confucian East. The Ming Dynasty was established after the overthrow of the Mongol invaders in 1368. The Mongols had depopulated China by 1/3, returning it to almost the population levels of the Han Dynasty 1200 years earlier. The country's infrastructure was in shambles. The early Ming rebuilt the canal system, the shipbuilding capacity, and other critical infrastructure, while reviving the educational policies and the Confucian tradition developed by Xu. Between 1405 and 1435, grand armadas composed of the world's largest and most technologically advanced ocean-going ships explored the Indian Ocean, the Persian Gulf, and the east coast of Africa, peacefully exchanging goods, bringing ambassadors back to China, and carrying out geographic and political mapping of the Indian Oceans. Yeah, there's actually a statue of one of these explorers in Kenya. Can't remember his name right now. I'm having a brain fart, but it was in the 1400s, and where they've built the new SGR in Kenya, they have a statue of him.
Oh, you mean the famous Admiral
Xi Chang or something?
Wait, Jerry, say it again.
I think it's Admiral He.
Zheng He.
Yeah, exactly.
Zheng He.
Zheng He. Yeah.
Okay, huh.
Yeah, so that like I've been, and they have a beautiful statue of him where they've just built the new standard gauge railway in Kenya that was built in China. And there's a big plaque with a little bit of a history lesson about him and what he did in discovering the coast of East Africa and whatnot. Or yeah,
beautiful,
doing his mapping out and whatnot. The abrupt ending of these voyages in 1435, marking the end of the early Ming expansion and the onset of a long, slow decline in the Ming over the next 200 years, has never been adequately explained.
Oh, wait, let's read that footnote.
Yeah.
Who wants to read that?
Okay, I will read it. Okay, go Bob.
It is an extraordinary historical coincidence that the momentous Council of Florence of 1437 to 1439, which launched the Golden Renaissance in Europe, including the plans which led to the Columbus voyages later in the century, was virtually simultaneous with the disastrous retreat from global exploration in China.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, having in mind, because it's so often the case that we're used to evaluating cultures in a bubble, but it's so fruitful to have this dynamic approach where you're looking not just at China in a vacuum, but you're thinking of it in the mind always in parallel with the co-evolution of Western civilization too, and Africa, as parts of one unifying whole. It's very it's very healthy.
Right. You know, it's funny because what this reminded me of was that there at one point many years ago, LaRouche was talking about evidence that there was a voyages from Egypt to South America. That I haven't thought about that for a long time, but it kind of reminded me of this.
Bob, did you read Kwan's report, his review of the documentary on the Secret of the Pyramids that we posted on the Rising Tide Foundation?
No, I'll read that.
Oh man, you're gonna love this documentary and Kwan's write-up. I'll send it to you immediately as soon as this is done. You're
oh, thanks. Yeah.
You'll flip.
Thanks.
Okay. Nick, do you want to go for it is?
Sure. It is important for our purposes to note that the debate over the Great Voyages had an eerie similarity to the Han Dynasty's salt and iron debates, in that many of the Confucian scholar officials in the court argued against the exploration. As in the Han, they complained that such great projects were too expensive for the government coffers, that the results did not yield an immediate short-term benefit for China, and thus were not necessary. Although Xu Zi was officially the orthodox standard, the parochialist arguments of the Confucians against scientific missions of discovery were hardly in keeping with Xu Zi's insistence that the extension of knowledge lies in fully apprehending the principle in things, or to his instructions to a student that when he encounters anything at all in the world, to build upon what is already known to him about principle, and to probe still further to that, so that he seeks to reach the limit. The voyages.
All right, footnote 32 is these words are taken from a chapter which Zhu Xi had written himself and added to the Great Learning section of the Book of Rites. Zhu Xi argued that he had determined on historical and epistemological grounds that such a chapter declining the scientific method in the Great Learning must have previously existed, only to be lost over time. Yeah, I have a book written in 1890 comparing the evolution of Platonic Christianity and Confucianism, where the author also makes the point that this chapter was likely destroyed by people who were politically afraid of the scientific method being made transparent in the Chinese cultural matrix. It's a really strong thesis.
I'll continue.
Yeah.
The voyages were discontinued, while the Ming emperors increasingly isolated China from the rest of the world over the next century, even outlawing any travel abroad. This paralleled a degeneracy internally, including a turn against the Zhuxi tradition entirely. In the early 16th century, a pragmatic, anti-scientific version of Confucianism, reflecting both Zen Buddhism and Taoist influence, was developed by Wang Yangming, which became known as the School of Mind. Although this school of mind has been historically lumped together with Zhuxi's school of principle, both being referred to as Neo-Confucian in the West, Wang Yangming was diametrically opposed to Zhuxi's fundamental principle. He advocated a contemplative, pragmatic Aristotelianism as against Zhuxi's Platonic approach based on science and Ren, agape. Wang, while calling himself Confucian, rejected metaphysical speculation on the reality of things, as associated with Mencius and Zhuxi, in favor of an existentialist view based on intuition. Just as the Enlightenment figures in Europe rejected the existence of any universal criteria for measuring truth, either in the physical sciences or in questions of morality, so also Wang Yangming argued that the individual mind is beyond good and evil, a concept Nietzsche would later embrace. He specifically denied Zhuxi's scientific method as expressed in The Great Learning. Wang wrote, quote, "Extension of knowledge is not what later scholars understood as enriching and widening knowledge. It means simply extending my innate knowledge of the good to the utmost. Each individual is free to determine the truth and the good as he wishes, unhampered by concerns of measuring or proving such truths in the real physical world, as seen in the progress or decay of society." The further degeneracy among Wang Yangming's followers into various radical ideologies, which could easily be mistaken for the countercultural morass of post-1966 America, led to the collapse of the Ming Dynasty in 1644. It was during these declining days of the Ming that the Jesuit missionaries, led by the brilliant Matteo Ricci, 1552 to 1610, came to China, bringing the scientific and cultural fruits of the Renaissance with them. Ricci quickly recognized the striking parallels in Confucius and Mencius to the Christian concept of man in the image of God, and devoted his life to building an ecumenical alliance between China and the West. He discovered that it was those who believed in the ideas of Confucius and Mencius, rather than the adherents of Taoism and Buddhism, who were well prepared to accept the notion of the one true God. He believed that nothing prevented a Confucian from becoming, at the same time, a Christian. This issue, however, was to become the focus of a century-long battle between the Renaissance leaders, including Johannes Kepler and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, together with their Jesuit allies against Venice and the European oligarchy, who violently opposed the spread of the Western Renaissance to China. Just as Venice created the Enlightenment as an oligarchical contain and control operation against Platonic Christian science and the emerging nation states in Europe, so did the Venetians expend every possible resource to disrupt the emerging ecumenical alliance between East and West. Such an alliance, then as today, is the opposite of empire, which depends upon division and subservience. Unfortunately for human history, the Venetian operation against China was successful. The so-called rights controversy ended in disaster both for China and the West. The question of the meaning of the rites was reduced to a quibbling debate over the ritual practices involved in the ceremonies honoring Confucius and venerating the dead, and over the words used to translate Christian terms. The defenders of the ecumenical policy were often driven by their detractors into defensive positions, attempting to explain the ritualistic practices, such as whether or not spirits existed in stone slates engraved with the names of departed ancestors. The higher meaning of the rites, as the measure of the principle of heaven, as expressed in the Book of Rites itself, was largely ignored by those committed to destroying the grand design. Leibniz and his Jesuit collaborators in China attempted to force a debate to the higher level. Leibniz was already engaged in two major endeavors to rebuild the ecumenical and political unity of Europe against the Venetian divide and conquer policies of the Enlightenment. He fought to reunite the Christian Church, drawing on the unity of science and religion inherent in the Platonic Christian worldview, in order to counter the Venetian Aristotelian influence in both the Catholic and Protestant denominations. At the same time, he tried to reunite the Eastern and Western division of Christianity, with a particular emphasis on recruiting Russia to his grand design. Working directly with Peter the Great, Leibniz inspired the founding of the Russian Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg and recruited Peter to collaboration on global scientific experiments and investigation.
Hey, Nick, could you keep your body a little bit to the right? Because the sound vector, for some reason, when you're speaking, yeah, like right now, say something right now.
Hey.
Yeah, so much better. For some reason, the sound vector from that direction is being received by your mic better than when you're on your left.
Thank you. You just taught me something I didn't know. Because this seems to be a recurring problem. I don't know what's happened to my mic, but it's, yeah, gotten a little bit sensitive lately.
No, this is perfect. This is actually like professional quality right now.
Cool. All right, I'll just place the Is that, yeah, that's good, yeah?
Yeah.
To bring China into his global vision, Leibniz dedicated his journal, Novissima Sinica, to presenting to Europe the great culture and philosophy of China. His own writings analyzed the works of Zhu Xi, demonstrating that Zhu Xi's concepts of Li, principle, and Ren, agape, were coherent with the scientific and moral truths discovered during the Christian Renaissance. Footnote.
All right, yeah, we got a big footnote. Who wants to read footnote 33?
I'll read it. Matteo Ricci had denounced Zhu Xi together with all the so-called Neo-Confucians. He asserted that they had all inserted irrational and mystical beliefs from Buddhism and Taoism into the original Confucian and Mencian worldview, which he considered to be the only form of Confucianism compatible with Christianity. However, his view was shaped by the degenerate state of Confucian studies in the late Ming. Ricci was in China between 1583 and 1610, and influenced by Wang Yangming and by the many splinter groups which followed him. Ricci appears to have followed those among his contemporary Chinese scholars who interpreted Zhu Xi according to the distortions introduced by Wang Yangming. After Ricci's death and following the collapse of the Ming, Wang Yangming and his followers were widely and correctly blamed for the moral decline which brought down the Ming Dynasty, while Zhu Zi's Song Renaissance ideas were revived. The great Qing Dynasty Emperor Kangxi promoted both Zhu Zi and Christianity.
But the battle was lost. Under Venetian influence, a series of papal bulls in the early 18th century declared that converts to Christianity in China must renounce Confucianism and all the rites associated with it. The immediate result was to thrust Christianity itself into open political opposition to the Chinese government. Since the rituals of government service were based on the Confucian rites, the papal bulls effectively required Christian converts to renounce government service. In a nation built on the principle that government servants must be chosen from among the leading scholars, Christian proselytizing was no longer seen as a contribution to Chinese civilization, but as a serious threat to the unity of the country. The Christian missionaries were expelled and the practice of Christianity suppressed. Leibniz's grand design was indefinitely postponed.
Nick, do you want to read the next section, and then we'll round it out for this?
The return to empire. The destructive impact of the rights controversy was felt both in China and the West. The absolute break with the advanced culture in China strengthened the hand of the empire builders in Europe, which by then was centered in the Venetian party in England. As the Enlightenment spread its pessimism and moral decay across Europe, the scientific and Renaissance shifted their base of operations to the New World, giving birth to the United States of America at the end of the century. In China, as in Europe, there were also a return to the ideas of empire. There had been a tentative move toward the principles of the nation state during the 1662 to 1722 reign of Kangxi, predicated upon the ecumenical alliance of Confucian and Christian principles, and dedicated to advanced universal education. This gave way to a return to the three religions and international isolation. The scientific and cultural advances of the Kangxi era carried over to some extent through the 18th century. The long reign of Qianlong from 1736 to 96 was relatively prosperous, but the creative breakthroughs of the earlier period were not sustained. Most importantly, Confucian scholarship reverted to the stultified empirical methods of the Han Dynasty, even adopting the name Han Learning for their new school. Also called evidential research, this school has been appropriately described by Benjamin A. Ellman, a scholar in the tradition of British psychological warrior Joseph Needham, in his book From Philosophy to Philology, as a revolutionary development which transformed Confucian inquiry from a quest for moral perfection to a programmatic search for empirically verifiable knowledge, bound up with the same condition that produced the Enlightenment. As the name of Ellman's book implies, the Han Learning scholars turned away from the philosophic inquiry, preferring a sterile form of philology, which explicitly ruled out all new ideas. While philological research into the source and meaning of words and texts can be a valuable aid in research, it is absurd to assert, as did the Han Learning scholars, that ideas can only be understood through clinical analysis of the original meaning of words. In fact, an original idea can only be discovered or transmitted to others through metaphor, by posing a solution to an unfamiliar or apparently contradictory situation through evoking familiar terms and ideas in a new context. Confucius's rectification of names was aimed precisely at such a continuous process of perfection in the understanding of words, in order to replicate new ideas in the minds of men. But the leading figure of the evidential research, Han Learning's school, Daizhen, 1724 to 1777, ruled out such innovation. Quote, "The classics provide the root to Tao. What illuminates the Tao is their words. How words are formed can be grasped only through philology and paleography. From the study of primary and derived characters, we can master the language. Through the language, we can penetrate the mind and will of the ancient sages and worthies." End quote. This reductionist
on that footnote,
Yeah.
compare this to Shuzi, Shushi, who added a new chapter to the classics in order to expand upon the original ideas. That's all it says.
This reductionist method is matched by today's leading deconstructionist, Jacques Derrida, one of Roger Aimes' guru. Derrida, like the Han Learning scholars, dissociates the meaning of words from the thought process of the individual using the words, insisting that the meaning of the text is as if fixed in stone, each word a rock with a fixed weight and shape. Not only is it impossible to express new discoveries and ideas with such dead weight, but even the philological effort to discern the meanings of ancient texts is rendered useless, since the ideas of the sages were and are living entities, not dead, cold definitions in a computerized dictionary.
Yeah, that's a bigger footnote. 37. Yeah, Bob, you want to read 37?
Sure. On Jacques Derrida, see Webster Tarpley, Deconstructionism, the Method in the Madness, Fidelio, summer 1993. It is lawful that the followers of the Deconstructionist school would attempt to reduce language to a computerized system, creating the field of artificial intelligence. The works of Norbert Wiener, Noam Chomsky, and others in this effort are based on the absurd premise that the mind is a machine. While such endeavors can discover nothing useful about the creative powers of the human species, they have proven useful as tools of behavior modification, brainwashing, as the Tavistock Institute calls it, of individuals or entire societies, which have been conditioned through social convulsions or terror to believe they must choose among fixed, predefined alternatives.
Thank you.
Daizhen denounced Shuji in the School of Principle for daring to use words like li, principle, itself, in a new way to express a newly discovered idea. Here again, the 18th century Han Learning scholars were only following the lead of China's Aristotle, Zhenzi, who had demanded that names of things must be fixed and clear in order that the king would be clearly understood. What a useful excuse. To split words, quote, "To split words and recklessly make up new names," wrote Zhenzi, "causes men to argue and contend with each other, a terrible evil, and should be punished. Then people will not dare use strange words, but will become simple and honest and easy to employ, obey the law, follow the orders." End quote, i.e. good helots. The Song Confucians were guilty indeed of this crime of metaphor. Zhu Xi's principle, Li, was not the Li of the Taoists, complained the philologists, and therefore was not legitimate. What actually disturbed them was the higher concept developed by Xu Zhi, making Li the connection between man's reason and the laws of the physical universe. What radical Aristotelians everywhere fear is the tyranny of reason. Dai Zhen complained, quote, the high and the mighty use Li to blame the lowly. The old use Li to blame the young. The exalted use Li to blame the downtrodden. End quote. This appeal against authority, especially the authority of reason, was to become a common cry of the existentialist pantheon of the deconstructionists, from Nietzsche to Russell to Heidegger and the Frankfurt School. Footnote 38.
That's a big one too. Who would like to read that one?
I'll read it again. Professors Ames and Hall, in Anticipating China, reach out to the 17th and 18th century school of Han learning to attempt to deal with the obvious flaw in their effort to describe all of the Chinese history as dominated by Taoist correlativist forms of thought, namely their inability to explain the existence of Zhu Xi and the Song Renaissance. Ames admits that the Song Confucians dramatically changed the intellectual landscape of China and that it could be described as an experiment in rationalism. But he blithely concludes, these are complex claims and we are simply not ready to speculate on them, indicating that if they were to write another book, they might examine the Song school of principle. But Ames points to the Han learning of the school of evidential research for their sustained attack on the speculative rationalism of the Song Ming. He concludes, this assault on speculative philosophy and return to culture, artifact, and historical record as standards of evidence by the King scholars has to be factored into any attempt to assay the explanatory force of Han thinking as a persistent feature in defining contemporary Chinese culture.
In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the old debates over Sun Zi versus Mencius and Xu Zhi versus Wang Yangming heated up both in the core and in the independent centers of scholarship, which were dominated by the school of evidential research. The return to Han learning had become increasingly financed not by the government, but by the merchant class, especially in the South. This was precisely the era of the increasing presence of the British East India Company, smuggling massive amounts of opium from their poppy plantations in India into the coastal areas of China. Many southern Chinese merchants were getting rich trading tea and silk for smuggled opium. In England, this same dope-dealing East India Company and related crown financial institutions purchased a stable of philosophers and economists to justify their overtly tyrannical, racist, and immoral activities in building the British Empire. Those directly on the East India Company payroll included Adam Smith, whose invisible hand and free trade were nothing more than theoretical cover for the empire and its drug business, and John Stuart Mill, who carried on Smith's tradition by discussing the utility of colonial looting. The British Crown dope peddlers worked a similar process in China. The merchant-controlled cabal of Han learning scholars became the leading promoters of legalizing opium and giving the British unrestricted freedom to spread their filth, both ideological and material. One of the foremost ideologues of the Han learning, Huang Yuan, became Governor General of Guangdong in the 1820s. Guangdong was the only port open to foreign trade in China at that time. Although the British opium ships traded illegally along the coast as far north as Tianjin, Huang Huang Yuan became the apologist for both the British and the opium. As Ellman admits in his book, Praising the Han Learning, the legalizers, first the moralists, in the Canton opium debate reflected in many ways the widening rift between Han learning and Sung learning. There was, in fact, a significant resurgence of Song Confucianism at that time, in resistance to the cultural pessimism of the school of Han learning, especially their embrace of the British campaign to addict population to drug slavery. One of the most outspoken leaders of this resistance was Fang Dongxu, 1772 to 1751, who wrote that the evidential research scholars really have no desire to seek the truth or to get at the facts. About all they are interested in is to establish theories that will overturn the Sung Confucians. Fang attacked Huang Yuan's policies as Governor General of Guangdong as a complete failure, demanding instead the complete eradication of opium and the British opium trade. When the emperor finally acted in 1839 to crush the opium scourge, he deployed the leading scholar and statesman in the country, Lin Shizhu, 1785 to 1850, to Guangdong to take control and impose total eradication. Loy set up his headquarters at the academy associated with Fang, the outspoken opponent of Guangdong Governor General Huang Yuan, clearly delineating the dividing line between, on the one side, Zhuxi Confucianism, the unity of China, and opposition to British opium, and on the other, the Han learning, moral relativism, and treasonous collaboration with British imperial ambitions. The British response to China's sovereign defense of its people is infamous. 2 opium wars spanning the 1840s through the 1860s, imposing the right to British free trade in drugs, destroying the minds of millions of Chinese, and effectively taking over the Chinese economy as a source of loot for the empire. In 1842, Fang Dongxu identified the root cause of China's defeat by the drug lords of London. Quote, "The disaster at the hands of the English barbarians was not the result of the recent policy of total prohibition and confiscation of opium. In fact, it resulted because of the rapacious and corrupt behavior of the foolish foreign merchants, the vacillating policies of earlier governors general Huang Yuan, who have cultivated a festering sore, and the greed of Chinese traitors who sold out their country." End quote.
There's a really, really good 1999 movie called The Opium War, sponsored by the Chinese government, which is available for free on YouTube. Really, really good. That's a good place. It's now 10:07 to end it for this week's reading, and we'll be able to pick it up again. We'll probably have 2 more readings. Maybe we can get it done in 1 more reading. I'm not too sure yet, but we'll see. What do you guys think? Mike's a pretty smart guy, eh?
Oh yeah. One hell of a writer and researcher and the whole 9 yards. It's really compiled a great historical research here.
Yeah, it's a real tour de force article.
Mm-hmm.
The way he combines, all these different dynasties and stuff as well, you get like a whole really rounded idea of Chinese culture and the battles that they face and how similar they are to what we have in Western philosophy as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Yeah.
so many.
And
Oh yeah, go on.
And the translation of "run" by agape, meaning the underlying emotion of creativity and discovery, is probably outstanding. Anyway, it's probably the most outstanding translation that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I think this is like one of the common denominators I find amongst all sorts of people who tend to be very easily swayed into believing that China is the boogeyman, the evil doer of the world, is that they just have a very one-dimensional, cartoonish idea of what China is. They have no sense of its history, of the rich internal battles of ideas within the cultural matrix. They have no sense of British or foreign intelligence agencies at all. None of that. So they're just fertile soil for misinformation and falling prey to all sorts of lies. So reading something like this is just a really, really great way of just enforcing our understanding of what this fight is really about.
One thing on that, one comment I have on that, it's kind of interesting. This
Hey,
whole
Bob,
controversy about.
could you talk into the computer a bit more? Like Nick had that same problem. Whatever angle
you
you're
have
speaking from right now is
uh,
not working.
all right. Well, I'm talking into my microphone in my hearing aid. But anyway,
Ah.
you hear about this stuff about intellectual that the Chinese are stealing intellectual property
Yeah.
of the West. That's always one of the big bugaboos that we have to protect our intellectual property. The fact of the matter is, at this point, every single day I'm looking at research that's going on in the West and China. There's absolutely at this time, it's ridiculous to say that China is stealing intellectual property, because their researchers are absolutely doing in all different areas of physics, biophysics, astronomy, the as good of the research or better quality, and they're collaborating all the time with universities in the West. This is the type of thing, this idea that they couldn't do anything on their own if they weren't taking the intellectual property of the West. It's a total, just what you're saying. It has no understanding at all what's going on. It's just completely based on a profile that people have of fear of the outsiders, and it's totally a false narrative.
Yeah, I mean, so much of society is built up on this idea that there must be an enemy all the time. I mean,
Yeah, enemy image.
that's always the part that you got to get past with people. It's like, yeah, like that they have this kind of boogie monster under the bed, and you're like, maybe take a look in the mirror and have a look at your own culture, and you might just find out what that is. Because as we see, all cultures have that boogeyman waiting in their culture, like to catch them. That's why education is so fundamental, like to a human mind, because only that can overcome these problems, these issues, these attacks on your soul, on your reason.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And that's what makes this approach that we're seeing displayed by Mike Billington just so like, I mean, for me, it's really just refreshing, because he's approaching from the standpoint first of mind and the natural, healthy way a mind works versus how a mind is corrupted to fall out of whack with its own nature. And by first starting with that epistemological foundation, you could then sort of penetrate and look to see where do political interventions occur that either enhance the natural movement of the mind versus pervert it and destroy those powers. And so, yeah, if you have a proper education system, the emphasis would not be on getting kids to pass tests and memorize stuff. It would really be to create opportunities for kids to discover how their own minds work when they're being natural, making discoveries, being happy, and thinking about the emotional states that occur when your mind works that way, and realizing how different those quality of emotions are to the lower order emotions, of like, I won the game and beat my competition. Yes, I feel great. it's not parallel to, oh, I made this great discovery and I want to share it. It's a different category of joy.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't really describe it in a linear way either. It's you have to sort of feel it and yeah.
Also, this idea of language being dead is very, very important because the idea of creating new concepts, of creativity, new words, for example. I recently wrote this piece about, if you look at the time of the language of drama of Shakespeare, you'll see that continuously new words are just, it's just something that's natural for that time. The rules were constantly being broken. There was no idea of a dead language of things, just nominalism. There were the idea that you could, the whole idea of thinking about the future, even the way that we don't even use the future tenses in the same way that Shakespeare did. They've been written out of language. The language has been deadened to a large degree, and it has a lot to do with the way in which we ingest entertainment, popular entertainment. That popular entertainment is just like the Roman bread and circuses for us today. You know, it has nothing to do with engaging the mind in being able to formulate new concepts in the way that Shelley was talking about, that should be the basis of what poetry is about. And the idea that this one scholar said, don't confuse us with new words. You know, it's very much what these deconstructionists, you can see why they picked up on this, because that's what these deconstructionists do. They say it's all dead. It's like the grammar trees of Chomsky. It's the same crap. Language is dead. It's just a tree of neurons. It's of artificial intelligence. That's why computers can think, because they have these huge, intricate complexity of trees that will rival human intelligence. But they can never come up with any new ideas because they can't understand what irony or metaphor is, because they're damn machines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I got a question, Bob. I know a little bit of Chomsky's ideas of like universal grammar and you know how everything sort of originates with grunts and whistles and some, but how does he account, how he accounts for the appearance of new words? Because obviously they happen. Does he have an explanation for how that occurs?
You know, I don't think, as far as what I've read, that he even manages to talk about that. In other words, what these guys will do in linguistics, I've had several courses in linguistics, which are based on his ideas and others, basically is this deconstruction, because it's the same thing. What they do is they take grammar trees, which are the idea of taking propositional logic. It's really no different than Russell. And it is based on it's based on the same way that Russell says that logic itself is complete. That it's a complete system. You can take whatever sentence structure you have and turn it into these grammar trees. That it's self-consistent. That's the idea. And in fact, that leads you to what Russell, his logical positivism is really the same. It's no different than Chomsky. It's a Russell thesis, really, when you think about it. It's no different.
Okay. Interesting.
Well, I sent in the chat a word. Yeah, I sent in the chat a word, generativity. It's the word invented by Chomsky to explain how new words can be created. But it's in the same meaning than what Bob said. It's a tree of language, but that tree has to be perceived not as something organic, but rather as a machine of artificial intelligence that will generate new words, but through rigid rules.
Hmm. So all of these
Right.
new words are like implicit in the rules already established in the system logically.
Right.
So you could like
can't
just
go-
actually extend the rules of the system to just generate new words without creative leap
Right.
or anything like that happening.
You cannot go outside that
Well,
system.
Yeah. Well, generativity is a nice word for machine.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, in fact, the fact that he teamed up with Marvin Minsky, who was artificial intelligence person, it's really, and that's the whole way in which these guys will take and say that we're going to generate language today. If you look at what they do, if the way that this thing works right now, when you start typing and you have these Microsoft will fill in the way that you're thinking. They'll try to create words for you. The automatic editing. It's all based on that. It all goes back to Chomsky and Minsky and Norbert Wiener and the whole thing. It's predictability. What they're saying is that you are completely predictable in what you're going to do, and it will know about what you're going to do before you do it. It's just a matter of processing your predictability faster. That's what computers can do.
Exactly.
It's like a chess game, right? The chess, you only have so many moves on this chess game, or if you want to get even go to a higher level, the game of Go, right? But you can't go outside the chessboard. You can't overturn the chessboard. You got to stay within that strict number of potential possibilities, an array. And it goes back to the idea of an array of possibilities, a matrix. And that, if you think about this matrix itself of logical matrices, that is the basis for the probability statistical models that are at the basis of quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics gives you a probability distribution that's based on a fixed array of possibilities. You can't go outside that.
That's interesting. You got to write something on that, Bob.
Well, I have. I've written all kinds of things about it. And I'll be talking about that later. And whenever March 21st, whenever you have that thing.
Yeah, when you give your lecture, right? Awesome.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that was the problem. We had a gentleman on for Dave's class. I remember on Sunday on Nicholas of Cusa, and he had some good points, but it was a little disappointing towards the end when he left the class in the discussion period, when he had written the message to everybody in the chat room saying, I used to believe that in the human mind, and I believe that we could always beat computer learning, but then that was 20 years ago, and since then computers have been created that we're able to beat the best humans in chess and Go, and now I think we're all doomed. And that was it. Like, and he actually was led to believe that chess and Go represented the quality of mentation that you see with a healthy human mind. He didn't see a difference in those two worlds. So yeah, sad.
That's a problem. That's a problem.
Yeah, AI, it's coming along on, like, for example, making nonsense copy, like just spitting out words and just stringing sentences together, and so the coherence of the sentences is getting better. But just things that are very, very simple for humans, for example, sarcasm. Humans, when they read something, they can generally tell when it's sarcasm, and AI is hopeless at it. Still, it's something very simple for the human mind to do. And the Go thing, Alphago, was touted as this big deal because Go is a very complex game. But it's like you said, try and have it imagine some new game. You know, from like obviously Go at some point didn't exist and humans created it, right? And then the only way you could have AI create a new game is by feeding it a bunch of examples of games that already exist. And then it would just take, you know, it would just iterate over a number of variations based upon the data set that you fed it, i.e. games that already exist, right? So it's like the human mind is capable of contemplating ideas that have never been thought before.
Right.
And AI, it doesn't work that way. It only works on feeding it data sets of knowledge that we already have. Mm-hmm. So how would it discover, for example, breakthroughs in science in, for example, the theory of gravity, moving from, you know, Newtonian gravity to, say, Einstein's space-time, and you know, gravity, there not being some Newtonian concept of a force of gravity, but that space-time itself is curved by the gravity of masses in the universe. How could AI make that leap? You know, there was no sequential data set that you could feed it in order to make a discovery like that.
Yeah, the idea that any machine can willfully do the good for the future of humanity. What is it going to do the good for? The future of machines? Does it have a will to strive to leave something behind after that machine is dead for the future of machines? I mean, it's absolutely absurd. Where is the principle of agape in machines?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
It can never exist.
Well, they don't have free will, so that's a problem. I mean, right there.
And there's this notion of, and it's a very Larouchian notion of what's the best way to put it, but where you have discontinuity,
yeah,
you know, where you have leaps, and so kind of a plug for my talk that I'm giving this week, but we'll be dealing with it in it on Sunday, about Darwinian views on evolution and increasing evidence now that opponents of Darwin were correct.
Yeah.
And that evolution does not occur as this linear process that you can just chart on a line, that there's discontinuities, there's jumps.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone's been watching all the discussion about Mars, because there's 3 actual missions that have gone to Mars, and one of them is the United Arab Emirates. And I read that and I said, no, there's got to be a typo. The UAE did this? Give me a break. Come on. But there's this video of this young lady. She's got to be in her 20s. And she's the head of the space agency for the UAE. And she describes the group that put this mission together to go to Mars. And it's like what you're saying, this discontinuity, it's such a leap. They go from nothing to sending a probe to Mars. How the hell do you do that? That's unbelievable. And she talks, the average age of the group is like 30 years old or something. And they just had this mission that was set out to them, and they just did it within a short period of time. I think it was 6 years. But it's fascinating. If you listen to her talk, it's only about 15 minutes, but here's this young lady, you know, Muslim on top of that. You know, we're supposed to have this crazy idea of Muslims as being terrorists, but she just comes across with this whole idea of hope for humanity and just this love of discovery and knowledge. It's
And
amazing.
Cynthia showed me her recent TED talk last night. Sarah, I forgot her last name. And yeah, it's just extraordinary how elevated her thinking is and the entire spirit of their program, which, I mean, you think about it like the UAE, and actually that's why Cynthia's not here today right now, because she's she has a deadline to write this article on that very topic in the other room for strategic culture.
Great.
So it should be out in the next day or two. But yeah, like you think this country is saturated in oil and petroleum. They could make so much money and have such an easy life if they just stuck with that. So why put all of this effort into a space program and to go beyond their limitations the way they are, and the way she's able to put it into words for the right reasons in terms of really breaking humanity out of our fixed shell of limitations and expand our understanding of the universe and have that return back to our understanding of our true nature as human beings. She's just super poetic. It's really, really quite the outlier.
Yes, it's unpredictable.
Yep.
Yep.
A lot of new words are going to have to be created if we if we make this thing properly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. Neologisms.
Yes, but I think that a word has to be said for the leadership of that country too, and it's the same for Qatar. I think that those small Arabic nations are quite the opposite of Saudi Arabia, precisely.
Yeah.
Yeah, up until recently, I had such a linear, simplistic view of the Arab nations of that zone, of the Gulf states and all of it. I didn't realize the nuance and complexity. It's becoming apparent finally.
Yeah.
One
of the things I did many years ago is I read the translations of the Arab or Islamic Renaissance. It's very well worth reading. For example, Avicenna, Ibn Rashid. These things are absolute. If you look at Avicenna's idea of the necessary existent, and then compare that to Cusa, and Leibniz, you'll see a direct line from Plato to Avicenna to Cusa, Leibniz. It's all there. It really is, and it's not accidental. Now, if you look at Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, that he pays homage to all of these great Islamic thinkers, and also Cervantes and what he does to bring that culture in Don Quixote as well. Mm-hmm. So it's there within in the same way, really, that these ideas that are of a dialogue form, a Socratic reason, is there in any culture which at some level, can be drawn out, and that's really the idea. If you want to think about sovereign nations, it's bringing out those potentials that are there in the language culture of any nation, really.
Yep. Exactly.
UAE is going nuclear as well.
Are they really?
Yeah, they're building them right now. South Korea, KEPCO is building them.
All right, great. Yeah, there's something special there. Really.
Yeah.
Well. All right, guys, it's getting late, so let's touch base. I guess hopefully everyone can be there on Sunday when Sam gives his class, which will debunk, as Sam just said, some of the linear, naive ideas of creativity and evolution in the universe.
Right.
And we'll meet up again for part 3 next Wednesday at 8 p.m.
Wait.
Alrighty.